Eleanor Harrington believed the world was divided into two distinct groups: people who mattered and the furniture. The furniture was there to serve, to facilitate, to be polished or replaced as needed. The janitor, the man whose name she had never bothered to learn, was a particularly unremarkable piece of furniture. He was tall and broad-shouldered, a fact she only registered as an obstruction when he was cleaning a hallway she wished to pass through. She saw his dark skin, his plain gray uniform, and his silence, and her mind filed him away under the category of invisible. She didn't know that this man, David, had a name. She didn't know he was a single father to a brilliant 10-year-old girl named Maya. And she certainly didn't know that the quiet man currently mopping up a spilled latte her son had carelessly knocked over in the foyer of the Northwood Military Academy's administration building had once, on a dust-choked mountainside in Afghanistan, held the lives of 200 soldiers in his steady hands and refused to let go. Within 48 hours, the pristine, orderly world Eleanor Harrington had so carefully curated would be shattered, and the man she considered less than dust would be the one holding the hammer. It's a story about how true worth is often hidden in plain sight, and how dignity is a fortress that no amount of arrogance can breach. If you enjoy stories like this, where patience and integrity finally get their due, I'd be so grateful if you'd hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us bring more stories to you. And I'm curious, where are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments below. Now, let's get back to the moment it all began to unravel. The mess was deliberate. Bryce Harrington, a cadet with his father's imposing name and his mother's casual cruelty, had not so much knocked the cup over as backhanded it off the table, while gesturing expansively to his friends. The creamy liquid had splashed across the polished marble floor, a Jackson Pollock of entitlement. A few of the other cadets snickered. Bryce didn't even look back. He simply expected the mess to be gone when he next passed by, the same way he expected the sun to rise. It was the natural order of things. David arrived a few moments later, summoned by a curt call from the front desk. He carried his mop and bucket, the tools of his current trade, with an unhurried grace. He didn't sigh. He didn't scowl. He placed his yellow caution, wet floor sign with the precision of a sapper setting a charge. His movements were economical, fluid, a study in quiet efficiency. As he worked the mop over the stain, his face was a mask of neutral concentration. But inside, the narrator of his mind was cataloging, observing, processing. He saw the way the light from the grand Palladian window caught the specks of cinnamon in the spill. He noted the brand of the coffee by the logo on the discarded cup, an expensive, cloying brew he wouldn't have chosen. He registered the faint, lingering scent of Eleanor Harrington's perfume in the air, a cloying floral that always seemed to announce her presence like a trumpet fanfare. He heard the echo of her son's laughter, thin and brittle. He processed these details not with anger, but with the detached analysis of a scout on reconnaissance. Anger was a luxury, a fire that consumed the fuel needed for the long journey. Patience was his shield. His daughter, Maya, was his mission. He finished cleaning the spill, the marble now gleaming, reflecting the high, vaulted ceiling and the stern portraits of past academy superintendents that lined the walls. Men of honor, the portrait suggested. Men of substance. David looked at their painted faces, their stiff postures and decorated chests, and felt a familiar, weary irony. They looked so much like General Harrington, Bryce's father, the current superintendent. A man who commanded a military academy dedicated to the principles of integrity, service, and respect, yet seemed utterly blind to the lack of all three within his own family. As David packed up his supplies, Eleanor Harrington swept into the foyer. She was a vision of tailored tweed and quiet wealth. Her silver blonde hair coiffed into a helmet of serene superiority. She didn't acknowledge David directly. Instead, she addressed the air in front of him, her voice carrying the clear, cutting tones of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I trust that unsightly mess has been dealt with?" she asked, her eyes scanning the floor as if searching for any lingering evidence of her son's carelessness. "Yes, ma'am. The floor is clean," David replied. His voice was deep and steady, a calm baritone that seemed to absorb the room's ambient sound. She finally deigned to look at him, her gaze sweeping over his uniform with a faint, barely perceptible wrinkle of her nose. Good. The dedication for the new Harrington Hall is in 2 days. The entire campus needs to be spotless. The Secretary of Defense is attending. There can be no mistakes. The implication was clear. He, and people like him, were potential mistakes. Potential sources of imperfection in her perfect world. "I understand, ma'am," David said, his expression unchanging. He met her gaze for a fraction of a second, his own eyes dark and unreadable. In that brief moment, an observer paying close attention might have seen a flicker of something. Not defiance, but a profound, ancient stillness, like the surface of a deep well. Eleanor felt a flash of irritation. The man's composure was unnerving. He should be more deferential, more visibly eager to please. He should be slightly hunched, his eyes downcast. This man simply stood there, solid and present, as if he were her equal. The thought was so absurd it almost made her laugh. "See that you do," she said, clipping the words. She then turned, her attention already moving on to the floral arrangements being delivered, her mind dismissing the janitor as completely as one dismisses a lamppost they have just walked past. David watched her go. He felt the familiar, dull throb of humiliation, a sensation he had learned to compartmentalize. He thought of Maya, of her bright, inquisitive face when he'd pick her up from school in his beat-up but reliable sedan. He thought of her homework spread out on their small kitchen table, of the way she would bite her lip when concentrating on a difficult math problem. He was doing this for her. This anonymity, this quiet life, was the price of her safety and his peace. He had seen enough of the world's chaos. He had chosen this quiet corner, this life of perceived insignificance, as a sanctuary. But as he pushed his cart toward the service elevator, his hand instinctively went to his back pocket, where he felt the reassuring outline of his wallet. Tucked inside, behind his driver's license and a worn school picture of Maya, was a battered, heavily creased challenge coin. It was thick, heavier than most, and the worn-down image on it was of a stylized angel with a rifle in one hand and a medic's bag in the other. It was a coin that didn't officially exist for a unit that few knew about. Touching it, he wasn't just a janitor. He was reminded of who he had been, and more importantly, who he still was beneath the gray uniform. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that a reckoning was coming. The Harringtons' world of careless spills and casual cruelty was built on a foundation far more fragile than they could ever imagine. The next day, the humiliation deepened, becoming more personal, more pointed. It was a quiet Tuesday, the kind of gray, overcast day that muted the vibrant greens of the academy's sprawling lawns. David was polishing the glass on the trophy cases in the main athletic building, a task that required meticulous attention to detail. He found a certain zen in the repetitive motion, the squeak of the cloth against the glass, the gradual emergence of a perfect, streak-free shine. He was working on a case dedicated to the Academy's legendary 1985 football team, a collection of silver-plated trophies and faded photographs, when Eleanor Harrington appeared at his side. She wasn't alone. With her were 2 other women, wives of influential board members, their chatter a high-pitched symphony of gossip and veiled complaints. Eleanor had clearly been giving them a tour, a display of her domain. She stopped abruptly, her eyes narrowing. "Wait a moment," she said, her voice laced with manufactured drama. She reached up to her neck, her perfectly manicured fingers fluttering against her skin. "Oh my goodness, it's gone." The other women gasped in sympathy. "Eleanor, what is it?" one asked. "My sapphire pendant," Eleanor announced, her voice rising in pitch. "The one Charles gave me for our 25th anniversary. It was a family heirloom. It was right here." She looked around frantically, though her eyes kept landing, with calculated precision, on David. He had frozen, his hand still holding the polishing cloth against the glass. He knew, with a sinking feeling, what was happening. This was not a genuine loss. It was a performance. A power play for the benefit of her audience. I was just in the general's office, Eleanor continued, her gaze now fixed on David. And then I walked through here. I haven't been anywhere else. She took a step closer to him. Her perfume, the same cloying floral, now an oppressive cloud. Have you seen anything? A small, platinum chain with a teardrop sapphire. The question was an accusation wrapped in a thin veil of civility. The other women were staring at him, their expressions a mixture of suspicion and a sort of horrified pity, as if he were a bug they'd just discovered on the fine china. David slowly lowered his arm. He kept his voice even, betraying none of the cold fury that was beginning to coil in his stomach. No, ma'am, I have not. Are you sure? Eleanor pressed, her voice dripping with insinuation. You've been here all morning. Alone. It would be very easy for something small to be pocketed. The word pocketed hung in the air, ugly and sharp. David felt the blood rush to his ears. He thought of his years of service, the security clearances he had held, the secrets he had kept that were 1,000 times more valuable than a piece of jewelry. He thought of the men who had trusted him with their lives, their limbs, their last words. And now, this woman was implicitly accusing him of being a common thief in front of her friends. He held her gaze. Mrs. Harrington, he said, his voice quiet but firm, each word carefully chosen. I've been cleaning this case for the last 30 minutes. My focus has been on the glass. If you believe you have lost something of value, Academy protocol suggests you should report it to campus security. They can review the security footage of the hallway. It was a perfectly reasonable, professional response. And that, for Eleanor, was the problem. It was not the response of a frightened, groveling servant. He had not stammered or looked at the floor. He had calmly suggested a logical course of action, subtly turning the tables on her, by referencing official procedure and the existence of cameras that would prove his innocence. He had refused to play his assigned role in her drama. Eleanor's face tightened. Her little performance had been derailed. She had expected him to become flustered, perhaps even offer to be searched, to prostrate himself in his innocence. Instead, he had met her aggression with calm competence. Well, I hardly think we need to involve security just yet, she said, forcing a brittle laugh. Her friends looked uncertain, the dramatic tension of the moment deflating into awkwardness. Perhaps I simply misplaced it. She gave David one last, venomous glare. Just be sure to keep your eyes open. With that, she turned and swept her friends away, her voice already shifting back to a lighter topic, leaving David standing alone in the sudden silence. He stood motionless for a long moment, the cloth still in his hand. The silence was louder than her accusations. He could feel the ghost of her suspicion clinging to him. He took a slow, deep breath, letting the anger crest and then recede like a tide. He would not let her break his composure. He would not give her that victory. He finished polishing the case, his movements just as precise as before. But something inside him had shifted. The quiet life he had sought was becoming a prison of a different sort. His patience was not infinite. Later that evening, after a dinner of macaroni and cheese with Maya, a dinner filled with her excited chatter about a science project involving a potato clock, David sat alone in his small, meticulously tidy living room. Maya was asleep, her soft breathing a comforting rhythm from the other room. He pulled a heavy, worn leather-bound journal from a locked footlocker he kept under his bed. This was a symbolic object, his true self bound in cowhide. To anyone else, it would look like a simple notebook. But inside, the pages were filled not with prose, but with a dense, intricate script of his own devising. There were architectural diagrams for sustainable housing, complex financial algorithms, and schematics for water purification systems. This was his real work. The janitorial job was a cover, a way to be present for Maya while his mind and his money worked silently in the background. The world saw a janitor. This book held the truth. He was an architect, an investor, a builder. He had left the military with more than just scars and a challenge coin. He had left with an idea, born in the water-starved villages of Helmand Province. An idea that had grown into a quiet, multi-million-dollar tech company that he ran through a trusted proxy. He opened to a fresh page and began to sketch. It was a design for a new kind of community center, with open spaces and soaring lines of natural wood and glass. It was a place for healing, for learning, for connection. As he drew, the frustration and humiliation of the day began to melt away, replaced by the clean, satisfying logic of lines and angles. He was building something. He was always building. But on another page, tucked into a back pocket of the journal, was a different kind of list. It wasn't a design. It was just a series of dates and short, clipped descriptions. October 12th, Bryce Harrington. Lottespiel. Deliberate. November 3rd, Eleanor Harrington. Implied theft of pendant. Public accusation. The list was short, but it was growing. It was his own private accounting, a ledger of disrespect. And as he closed the journal for the night, he knew, with a grim certainty, that there would be more entries before the week was out. The dedication of Harrington Hall was fast approaching, and it felt less like a ceremony and more like a deadline. A point on the horizon toward which all these currents of arrogance and resentment were inexorably flowing. The days leading up to the dedication of Harrington Hall were a whirlwind of activity, and for the Harrington family, a crescendo of self-importance. General Charles Harrington, a man whose spine seemed to be forged from the same steel as the Academy's gates, strode about the campus with an air of proprietorship. This building, this monument to his family's legacy, and more importantly, to their generous donation, was the capstone of his career. He saw the gleaming brass letters being affixed to the grand stone edifice, Harrington Hall of Leadership. It felt right. It felt deserved. His wife, Eleanor, was in her element. She moved through the preparations like a conductor, orchestrating every detail from the exact shade of the floral centerpieces to the gluten-free options on the catering menu. Her confidence was absolute, her arrogance a shining armor. She spoke to the staff, including David, not as people, but as extensions of her will. The windows on the second floor are streaked. See to it, this hallway smells of cleaner. It should smell of nothing. The dedication plaque must be polished every hour. David received these orders with his usual quiet equanimity. He polished, he cleaned, he ensured everything was perfect, his diligence a silent mockery of their assumption that he was incompetent. He was a ghost in the machine of their triumph, ensuring the gears turned smoothly while they remained blissfully unaware of his true nature. It was during this feverish preparation that Lieutenant Evans began to notice. Evans was a young English instructor, barely 5 years out of the academy himself. He was idealistic, still believed in the words carved into the stone monuments around campus: duty, honor, country. He saw the way Mrs. Harrington spoke to David, the way Cadet Harrington treated the civilian staff as his personal valets. It sat poorly with him, a sour note in the symphony of honor the academy purported to play. He found David in a supply closet, carefully measuring out a cleaning solution. The closet was small, but David had organized it with military precision, every bottle and broom in its proper place. "Excuse me," Evans said, hovering in the doorway. "David, right?" David looked up. He had seen the young lieutenant watching him. He saw the conflict in the man's eyes. "Yes, sir." "You don't have to call me sir," Evans said quickly, a flush rising on his cheeks. I wanted to say, I saw what happened with Mrs. Harrington and the pendant the other day. That was not right." David paused in his work, giving the young man his full attention. "She was upset about her necklace. She was looking for a target," Evans countered, his voice low. "And her son is worse. The way he treats people, it's not what we're supposed to be teaching here. It's not leadership." David simply nodded, letting the lieutenant speak. He offered no agreement, no shared complaint. He was a rock in the stream, letting the water of the man's conscience flow around him. "Anyway," Evans finished, feeling suddenly awkward, "I just wanted you to know that some of us see it. What you put up with." "I appreciate that, Lieutenant," David said, and the sincerity in his deep voice surprised Evans. It was a simple acknowledgement, yet it felt like a validation. David then turned back to his work, the conversation clearly over. Evans walked away feeling both better and worse. He had spoken up in a way, but he had spoken to the victim, not the perpetrators. He was a silent enabler who had found his voice only in the shadows of a supply closet. He hadn't changed anything. The encounter, however, solidified something in David's mind. The cracks in the Harrington's facade were visible to others. He was not alone in his assessment, even if he was alone in his patience. Meanwhile, David's own preparations continued. In the evenings, after Maya was asleep, his small apartment transformed into a command center. The kitchen table was covered in spreadsheets and legal documents, not Maya's homework. There were quiet, encrypted video calls with a man in a sharp suit in a high-rise office in New York, his lawyer and business manager, a man who only knew David as Mr. Sterling. "The final transfer is complete, Mr. Sterling," the lawyer said, his voice crisp through the laptop speakers. "The endowment is fully funded. Your anonymity is secure, as per your instructions. The Academy Board believes the donation came from an anonymous tech benefactor who wishes to honor fallen combat medics." "Good," David said. "And the deed transfer for the adjacent parcel. Finalized this morning. The Northwood Ravine Conservancy, of which you're the sole director, now owns the land directly behind the new hall. The Academy's plans for a Harrington Memorial Garden might run into some zoning issues." A ghost of a smile touched the lawyer's lips. David felt no triumph, only the grim satisfaction of a well-laid plan moving into its final phase. He was not a man of vengeance. He was a man of consequences. The Harringtons had built their house on sand, believing it was rock. He would not be the storm that washed it away. He would simply be the tide, which comes in, as it always does, regardless of the castles built in its path. He closed the laptop, the apartment falling silent again. The leather journal sat on the corner of the table. He picked it up, the worn leather cool and familiar in his hands. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. He knew every line, every calculation within. It was a testament to a life lived in the spaces between what people saw and what was real. A life of hidden strength, of quiet competence. The janitor, the father, the soldier, the architect, the investor. He was all of them. Soon, the world, or at least the small, gilded world of the Northwood Military Academy, would be forced to see it, too. The ceremony was tomorrow. The day before the ceremony dawned with a deceptive calm. A cool autumn sun cast long shadows across the manicured grounds of the academy. But beneath the surface, a frantic energy buzzed. White tents were being erected, chairs set up in precise rows, and the air hummed with the tension of 1,000 last-minute details. It was in the midst of this controlled chaos that Bryce Harrington created a problem born of pure, unadulterated entitlement. A new sculpture, a bronze eagle with a formidable wingspan, had been installed near the entrance of the new hall. It was a gift from another wealthy donor. Bryce and his clique of sycophants, emboldened by the festive atmosphere and their own sense of untouchability, decided it would be amusing to climb the sculpture for a series of triumphant social media photos. In his haste to get the best angle, Bryce slipped. He didn't fall far, but his flailing arm caught one of the eagle's delicate, outstretched wingtips. There was a sickening crack of metal giving way. The tip of the bronze wing, a piece weighing nearly 30 pounds, bent downwards at a severe, unnatural angle. Panic, a rare and unwelcome emotion, flashed across Bryce's face. This was not a spilled latte. This was real, expensive, and very visible damage. His father would be furious. The donor would be insulted. It was a disaster. His friends scattered, wanting no part of the fallout. Bryce was left staring at the mangled wing, his bravado evaporating in the cool morning air. It was then that David arrived, pushing a large rolling bin for the event trash. He took in the scene at a glance. The pale, panicked cadet, the damaged multi-thousand-dollar sculpture, the looming dedication ceremony. "Problem, cadet?" David asked, his voice calm. "It wasn't me. It just broke," Bryce stammered, his usual arrogance replaced by a boyish fear. David walked over to the sculpture, running a careful hand along the bent wingtip. He examined the break, the stress on the metal. He wasn't looking at it as a janitor wondering how to clean up a mess. He was looking at it as an engineer a problem solver. He could see the flawed weld, the point of weakness. If this piece comes off, someone could get seriously hurt, David said, more to himself than to Bryce. He looked at the cadet, whose face was now ashen. "Give me a service ladder and a coil of high-tensile wire from the maintenance shed, and a heavy-duty ratchet strap." Now, there was an authority in David's voice that Bryce had never heard before. It wasn't the subservient tone of the staff. It was the calm, clear voice of command. For the first time in his life, Bryce Harrington followed an order from a janitor without question. He ran. When he returned, David was already directing 2 other maintenance workers who had happened upon the scene. He had them position the ladder. He took the wire and, with a series of quick, expert knots a sailor or a mountaineer would recognize, he secured the damaged piece to the main body of the wing, distributing the tension to prevent further damage. Then he used the ratchet strap as a temporary splint, cinching it tight with a series of powerful clicks. The repair was discreet, almost invisible from a distance. It would hold until a proper welder could be brought in after the ceremony. The entire operation took less than 10 minutes. David wiped his hands on a rag, his expression unreadable. "It will hold," he said. He looked at Bryce. "Your father doesn't need this distraction today. Tell him you noticed the wing was damaged and you secured it before anyone could get hurt." Bryce stared at him, dumbfounded. He was being handed a way out. More than that, he was being handed a way to look like a hero. "Why?" he asked, the word coming out as a whisper. David looked at the cadet, at the nascent man who was being shaped by privilege and arrogance into a hollow imitation of a leader. "Because honor," David said softly, "is about what you do when no one is looking. And sometimes it's about what you do to protect the mission. The mission for today is this ceremony. Go." Bryce didn't need to be told twice. He sprinted toward the administration building, his mind already spinning the story of his quick thinking and decisive action. David watched him go, a profound weariness settling over him. He had just handed his tormentor a victory, a lie to burnish his tarnished image. But David's calculus was different. He hadn't done it for Bryce. He had done it for the academy, for the hundreds of other cadets who deserved a day without a scandal, for the integrity of the event itself. It was a tactical sacrifice for a strategic goal. Later that afternoon, as David was doing a final sweep of the new hall's auditorium, Eleanor Harrington found him. She was, of course, oblivious to the morning's drama. She had only heard the sanitized version from her husband, who was now proudly boasting of his son's initiative and keen eye. "You," she said, not bothering with his name. "Tomorrow, during the ceremony, you will be stationed by the back service door, out of sight, but I want you to be ready. After the dedication, when we are mingling, I'm sure there will be spills. You will be on call to handle them. Discreetly. We can't have the press photographing messes. Do you understand?" He was to be her secret, invisible cleaner, a ghost to erase the blemishes from her perfect party. "I understand, ma'am," David said. "Good," she said, turning to leave. "Wear a clean uniform." As she walked away, her heels clicking on the polished floor, David stood in the vast, empty auditorium. The seats were all empty, waiting. The stage was set, the podium bearing the Academy seal. A quiet before the storm. He looked out the large windows at the setting sun, which painted the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. He thought of another sunset, years ago, over a rocky landscape a world away. He thought of the men who hadn't seen it, their faces etched in his memory. He went home. He made dinner for Maya. He checked her homework. He read her a chapter of her favorite book. He tucked her into bed and kissed her forehead. Then he sat in his living room in the dark, the framed photograph of his old unit on the small table beside him. It was a group of hard-faced men in dusty fatigues, grinning at the camera. They were brothers, forged in a crucible the Harringtons could never comprehend. He didn't look at the photo with sadness, but with a quiet resolve. Tomorrow, he would not be protecting the mission. He would be the mission. The day of the ceremony arrived wrapped in the crisp, brilliant blue of a perfect autumn afternoon. The sky was a flawless canvas, making the crimson and gold of the fall foliage on the Academy grounds seem impossibly vibrant. It was a day made for pomp and circumstance, and Northwood Military Academy did not disappoint. A military band played patriotic airs, their polished brass instruments glinting in the sun. Cadets in their immaculate dress gray uniforms stood in rigid formations, their posture a testament to the discipline drilled into them. High-profile guests streamed in, senators, captains of industry, decorated veterans, and, at the center of it all, the Secretary of Defense. General Charles Harrington was in his element, his chest puffed out, his dress uniform a constellation of medals and ribbons. He greeted guests with a firm handshake and a booming voice, the very picture of a modern major general. Eleanor, at his side, was radiant, a queen in her court, accepting compliments on the magnificent new hall as if she had laid the bricks herself. And David was there, a ghost in this grand pageant. He wore his janitorial uniform, starched and clean as requested. He was stationed by the rear service door of the new auditorium, just as Eleanor had commanded. He was out of sight, a silent sentinel of the service class, ready to be summoned to deal with the inevitable spills of the elite. He watched the proceedings on a small monitor in the service hallway, his face impassive. He saw Bryce Harrington being lauded by his father from the podium for his vigilance in discovering this structural weakness in the eagle sculpture. The lie was now canon, a part of the day's lore. David felt nothing. It was just one more data point in a long calculation. The speeches droned on. The Secretary of Defense spoke of leadership in the 21st century. General Harrington spoke of his family's long tradition of service. Finally, it was the moment of dedication. The General, Eleanor, Bryce, and the Secretary of Defense moved from the stage to the grand foyer, where the dedication plaque was veiled in a swatch of rich, burgundy velvet. A crowd of guests and a cordon of press photographers followed, jostling for position. David, following his orders, had moved from the service hall to the edge of the foyer, his cleaning cart discreetly tucked behind a large potted ficus. He was to be ready. General Harrington gave a final, brief speech. And so, he concluded, his voice thick with emotion, it is with immense pride that I, on behalf of my family, dedicate this Harrington Hall of Leadership to the future leaders of our great nation. With a flourish, Eleanor reached for the velvet cord. But just as she was about to pull it, she stopped. Her eyes, trained to find imperfection, had found one. Or, she had decided to invent one. She squinted at the bottom corner of the veiled plaque. "One moment," she said, her voice a stage whisper that carried across the suddenly silent foyer. Her eyes scanned the crowd and found her target. She pointed a long, elegant finger directly at David. "You, janitor, come here." A ripple went through the crowd. The press photographers, sensing a moment of unscripted drama, raised their cameras. David, his face a mask of neutrality, stepped out from behind the ficus tree. He did not hurry. He simply walked toward her, his posture straight, his gaze steady. "Mrs. Harrington?" he asked. She didn't look at him. She looked at the plaque. "There is a smudge. Right here," she said, pointing to a spot on the velvet covering. "On the brass. I can see it through the cloth. It's unacceptable." She turned her imperious gaze on him, her voice filled with sharp, public disdain. "I told you everything had to be perfect. Can't you people do anything right? Wipe it. Now." She was ordering him to polish a non-existent smudge on a plaque that was still covered, in front of the Secretary of Defense, 2 senators, and a dozen flashing cameras. It was the ultimate act of humiliation, a public demonstration of his status as her servant. She was marking her territory, asserting her dominance in the most demeaning way possible. The air in the foyer grew thick with embarrassment. General Harrington looked mortified, but said nothing. Bryce smirked. Lieutenant Evans, standing near the back, felt a hot flush of shame for David and for himself. David did not move. He simply stood there, letting her words hang in the air. He looked at her, and for the first time, his eyes were not a deep, unreadable well. They were burning. And then, a new voice cut through the tense silence. A voice that carried the easy authority of a man who had never had to demand respect, only commanded. "He's done more than you could ever comprehend, Eleanor." The voice belonged to a man standing near the Secretary of Defense. He was in his late 50s, his hair silver at the temples, his face etched with the lines of a man who had seen too much but had never looked away. He wore the uniform of a full colonel, and his chest bore a silver star, a bronze star with a V for valor, and 3 purple hearts. He was Colonel Marcus Miller, a living legend in the special operations community and a guest of the secretary. He began to walk forward, his polished shoes clicking with deliberate purpose on the marble floor. The crowd parted for him. He did not look at Eleanor. His eyes were locked on David. General Harrington, seeing a man of equal rank to himself and a friend of the secretary's, tried to intervene, to smooth over his wife's appalling breach of decorum. Miller, just a bit of last-minute polish. You know how these things are. Eleanor, furious at the interruption, turned on the colonel. This has nothing to do with you, Colonel. This is a staff issue. Colonel Miller stopped directly between Eleanor and David. He finally turned his head to look at her, and his eyes were chips of ice. A staff issue, he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. He then turned to the assembled crowd, his voice rising to fill the cavernous space. He raised his arm and pointed, not with a condescending finger like Eleanor, but with an open hand, a gesture of profound respect. He pointed directly at David. That man, Colonel Miller said, his voice ringing with an iron conviction that seized the attention of every person in the room. That man you're trying to humiliate in front of your friends, that janitor. That man saved 200 lives in Afghanistan, and my life was one of them. The statement landed in the silent foyer with the force of a physical blow. A quiet bomb, as the JSON profile would say. It was simple, devastating, final. Eleanor Harrington's face, which had been a mask of haughty indignation, seemed to crumble. The cameras, which had been poised to capture a janitor's humiliation, now flashed furiously, capturing the utter shock on the face of the general's wife. Disbelief was the first reaction. A collective, silent gasp rippled through the crowd. General Harrington stared, his mouth slightly agape, as if Miller had started speaking in a foreign tongue. Eleanor's hand, which had been pointing accusatorily, fell limply to her side. Bryce's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of slack-jawed confusion. Colonel Miller let the weight of his words settle. He had the audience completely. He turned his body slightly, addressing the Secretary of Defense, but speaking loudly enough for all to hear. His gaze, however, remained fixed on David, a look of fierce, unwavering loyalty. It was Operation Steadfast Guardian, Mr. Secretary, Miller began, his voice taking on the cadence of an after-action report. Karingal Valley. We were on a joint operation with the Afghan National Army, a humanitarian mission to a remote village. My unit, a detachment of Green Berets, was providing security. We walked into a complex ambush, a professionally planned, 3-sided kill box. The military men in the room stiffened. They knew what that meant. It was a death sentence. They hit us from the high ground with RPGs and heavy machine guns. Our lead vehicles were disabled, blocking the road. Our command element was wiped out in the first 30 seconds. Every officer, including myself, was either killed or severely wounded. Our communications were down. We were cut off. We were dying. Miller's voice was devoid of emotion, which made the story he told all the more harrowing. He was not telling a story for dramatic effect. He was stating facts. We took refuge in a series of old, crumbling compounds. The fighting was house to house, room to room. The wounded were piling up. Our medics were overwhelmed. One was killed. The other lost his hands. He paused, letting that horrific image sink in. We were out of morphine, running low on ammunition. The enemy was closing in, preparing for a final assault to wipe us out. We were counting our last rounds, preparing to be overrun. For 6 hours, we were in hell. He turned his head slowly, his icy gaze sweeping over Eleanor and then General Harrington. And in the middle of that hell, one man stood up, our senior medic, a sergeant first class. He wasn't an officer. He was an enlisted man. When all the leaders were down, he became the leader. When all hope was lost, he became hope. Colonel Miller took a step closer to David. For 6 hours, This man you call Janitor, ran from casualty to casualty under constant, direct fire. He treated over 60 wounded men, American and Afghan. He performed procedures in the dirt with nothing but a headlamp and the tools in his bag that would make a trauma surgeon blanch. He used his own body to shield a wounded Afghan child from a grenade blast. Miller's voice cracked for the first time, a hairline fracture of emotion in the granite of his delivery. He pointed to a faint, silvery scar just above his own eye. I was bleeding out from a piece of shrapnel on my neck. I was given my last orders. The last thing I saw before I blacked out was his face, leaning over me, telling me to stay with me. He clamped the artery with a hemostat and literally held my life in his hand for 2 hours until a medevac could even think about getting in. He turned back to the crowd. He organized the remaining soldiers, established a defensive perimeter, and directed devastatingly accurate air support using a dying radio man's gear. When the quick reaction force finally broke through, they didn't find a routed, defeated unit. They found a fortress. They found 200 soldiers and civilians alive because one man refused to let them die. A profound silence filled the hall. The only sound was the frantic clicking of cameras. General Harrington, finally finding his voice, sputtered, "Miller, it must be a case of mistaken identity. Our janitor, he's a good worker, but..." The sentence trailed off, its own absurdity hanging in the air. Mistaken identity? Miller's voice was laced with contempt. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a worn, creased photograph. It was the same one from David's apartment. A group of grinning, grimy soldiers in the Afghan sun. Miller pointed to a figure in the center, his face smudged with dirt and blood, but his eyes clear and focused. He was younger, leaner, but it was unmistakably David. His name is Sergeant First Class David Sterling. Call sign, Doc Angel. He was recommended for the Medal of Honor. He turned it down. He said he was just doing his job. He said the men who didn't make it home were the heroes. Miller looked at David, his expression softening. "We thought you were dead, Dave. Your records were sealed. A quiet discharge. No forwarding address. We thought we'd lost you." David finally spoke. His voice, when it came, was the same calm, steady baritone, but it now carried the weight of everything the room had just learned. "I didn't die, Colonel. I just had a new mission." He glanced towards the back of the room, as if looking for someone. "My wife passed away while I was on that rotation. I had a daughter to raise. The Army was my life, but she's my world. I chose her." The simple, powerful truth of his words resonated deeper than any military citation. He had given up a hero's mantle for a father's duty. And then David delivered the second blow, the one the Harringtons never saw coming. He looked directly at General Harrington. "General," he said, his tone respectful but firm, "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding about the nature of the donation for this building." He reached into the inner pocket of his gray janitor's jacket and pulled out a single folded document. It was a simple letter, enclosed in a plain white envelope, the symbolic object hidden in plain sight. "The 8-figure anonymous donation that funded the construction of this hall," David said, his voice clear and precise, "was made with a single, legally binding stipulation, that the building be dedicated not to a family, but to a principle. It was to be named the Sterling Hall for Valor, to honor the service and sacrifice of all military combat medics, corpsmen, and pararescuemen." The name Harrington was never part of the agreement. He unfolded the document. "I know this because I am the anonymous donor. If Colonel Miller's revelation had been a bomb, this was the apocalypse. The world of Eleanor Harrington did not just crack, it atomized." The blood drained from her face, leaving behind a pasty, slack-jawed mask of horror. General Harrington swayed on his feet, his face a mottled patchwork of red and white. He looked from a simple paper in David's hand to David's resolute face, and in that moment he understood. He had been outmaneuvered, outclassed, and utterly defeated by the man he hadn't even considered a player on the board. The foyer erupted into chaos. Reporters surged forward, shouting questions. "Mr. Sterling, is that true? General, what's your response?" Mrs. Harrington, a comet, Eleanor looked around at the faces staring at her, not with admiration or envy, but with a mixture of pity and contempt. Her perfect day, her monument, her legacy had all turned to ash in a matter of minutes. The foundation of her identity, her status, had been a lie, and the janitor she despised had just proven he was the one with the real power, the real wealth, the real honor. She made a small, wounded sound, like a deflating balloon, and her eyes rolled back in her head as she fainted dead away, collapsing in a heap of tailored tweed on the marble floor she had been so obsessed with keeping clean. In the immediate, chaotic aftermath, a strange clarity emerged. As paramedics attended to a theatrically unconscious Eleanor Harrington, the true lines of power and integrity in the room began to redraw themselves. The narrative had been irrevocably flipped. General Harrington, a man accustomed to commanding battlefields, was utterly lost. He stared at his wife on the floor, then at David, who stood calm and dignified amidst the storm he had unleashed. The general's mind, a tactical instrument, was struggling to process a defeat on a front he never knew existed. His entire worldview, which placed men like himself at the apex and men like David at the base, had been inverted. It was Lieutenant Evans, the silent enabler, who made the first move. Pushing through the throng of stunned guests, he approached David. His face was pale, but his eyes were resolute. "Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice clear, "on behalf of the decent people at this academy, I want to apologize. What you have endured, the disrespect, it was unacceptable. I saw it, and I said nothing. I failed my own standard of honor. That will change." It was a public confession and a pledge, a small act of bravery that seemed to resonate in the charged atmosphere. The Secretary of Defense, a shrewd politician who knew how to get ahead of a story, stepped forward. He bypassed the sputtering general and extended a hand to David. The cameras flashed, capturing the moment. "Mr. Sterling," the secretary said, his voice booming with authority, "your story of service is an inspiration. Your philanthropy is a testament to your character. The nation owes you a debt of gratitude, not once, but twice over." He then turned to Colonel Miller. "Colonel, I believe a review of Sergeant Sterling's recommendation for the Medal of Honor is long overdue. See to it." This was the final nail in the Harrington's coffin. The secretary had publicly validated David, endorsed the colonel's story, and implicitly condemned the general's family. In the ruthless political theater of Washington, General Harrington was now radioactive. His career was over. He knew it. Everyone in the room knew it. He finally looked at his son, Bryce, who was backed against a wall as if seeking to merge with the stone. The boy's face was a mess of confusion, fear, and for the first time, a dawning shame. His father's eyes, for the first time, did not hold pride, but a deep, bottomless disappointment. The dynasty was a sham. The legacy was a joke. David, meanwhile, handled the ensuing media storm with the same quiet competence he had used to fix the bronze eagle's wing. He answered questions simply, without embellishment or venom. "Why did you do it, Mr. Sterling? Why the secret?" a reporter shouted. "My life as a janitor wasn't a secret," David replied calmly. "It was my life. I came here to be a father to my daughter, Maya. That's the most important job I've ever had. The rest is just noise. What about the Harringtons? Do you want an apology?" David's gaze drifted to where the general was helping his now-revived, weeping wife to her feet. He looked at them not with hatred, but with a kind of clinical pity. "An apology is a word," David said. "Respect is an action. I think everyone here has learned a valuable lesson today about the difference between the 2-inch. He then held up the legal document. "As for this building," he announced, his voice cutting through the din, "work will begin on Monday to change the lettering. It will be dedicated as intended to the medics, the corpsmen, the PJs, the angels on the battlefield. Their names, not one family's, will be honored here." He then revealed the final, devastating detail. The Harrington Memorial Garden that was planned for the grounds behind this hall will have to be rethought. The land, as of last week, is now a protected nature conservancy. It will remain a wild space, a place for quiet reflection, not for monuments to vanity. It was a masterstroke, a final, perfectly executed move in a game the Harringtons never even knew they were playing. He hadn't just defeated them. He had dismantled their entire legacy, piece by piece, with the precision of a surgeon. As the crowd began to disperse, abuzz with the story of a lifetime, David was approached by the chairman of the Academy's Board of Trustees. "Mr. Sterling," the man said, his face grim, "we have a great deal to discuss. There will be changes. We would be honored if you would consider a position on our board. We clearly need your perspective." David simply nodded. "We could talk about that later. Right now, I have to go pick up my daughter from school." And with that, the man who had commanded a battlefield, built a fortune, and brought a powerful family to its knees, walked away. He went to the service locker room, changed out of his janitor uniform for the last time, and left the building whose name he had just reclaimed, a free man in every sense of the word. In the weeks that followed, the consequences of that day unfolded with the slow, grinding inevitability of poetic justice. The Harrington name, once a symbol of power and influence at Northwood, became a whispered cautionary tale. General Charles Harrington was granted an early retirement. He and Eleanor left the superintendent's grand residence on campus in the dead of night, avoiding the press and the pitying stares of the staff. They moved to a smaller, private home in a gated community an hour away, but the gates could not protect them from the fallout. Invitations to society events dried up. Phone calls went unreturned. Their social circle, built on the unstable ground of status and wealth, had evaporated. They were no longer people who mattered. They had become furniture. Eleanor did not handle the transition well. The loss of her status was, as David had perceived, a mortal blow to her very identity. She spent her days in a state of agitated depression, railing against the injustice of it all, blaming everyone but herself. She saw David Sterling's face on the news, being interviewed about his new foundation for the families of fallen medics, and she would descend into fits of rage and tears. She had not learned humility. She had only learned defeat. Bryce Harrington was subjected to an Academy Honor Board review. Lieutenant Evans, true to his word, testified about Bryce's pattern of behavior, his disrespect for the staff, and the truth behind the damaged eagle sculpture. Other cadets, emboldened by the new climate on campus, came forward with their own stories. Bryce was quietly expelled for multiple honor code violations. The lie that had briefly made him a hero had become the anchor that dragged him down. David, true to his word, met with General Harrington one last time. It was not a meeting of victor and vanquished. David had requested it, and the general, a broken man stripped of his rank and pride, had agreed. They met in a neutral space, a small, anonymous coffee shop far from the academy. The general looked a decade older. The steel in his spine was gone. "I don't know what you want me to say, Sterling," he began, his voice raspy. "I don't want you to say anything," David replied, stirring his coffee. "I want you to listen. For your whole life, you've been the one talking, and others have listened. I want you to understand something. This was never about revenge. It wasn't personal. It felt personal," the general muttered. "It was about principle," David corrected him gently. "The principles this academy is supposed to teach. Honor, integrity, respect. Your family, Charles, they used those words like a costume. They wore the uniform of honor, but they didn't live it. You let it happen. You were so focused on the grand legacy, the name on the building, that you ignored the character of the people inside it." David leaned forward, his voice dropping. "I didn't do this to destroy you. I did it to protect what you were supposed to be protecting. The soul of that place. Your son had the potential to be a leader, but you and your wife taught him that some people are beneath his notice. That's not leadership, that's tyranny. And it's a lesson that gets men killed in the field." The general flinched, as if struck. The truth of David's words hit him with the force of a physical blow. "What do you want from me?" Charles asked, his voice cracking. "I want you to be a father to your son," David said. "He's been expelled. His world has fallen apart. He can either become a bitter, resentful man who blames everyone else, just like his mother, or you can teach him what you failed to teach him before. That honor isn't about status. It's about how you treat the person you have power over. It's about owning your mistakes. It's about getting up after you've been knocked down and trying to be a better man. That's the only legacy that matters. David stood up, leaving a $20 bill on the table. You have a choice, General. You can fade away into bitter obscurity, or you can start a new mission. A quiet one. The redemption of your family. It's the hardest mission you'll ever face. I hope, for your son's sake, you don't fail. He walked out, leaving the former general sitting alone with the weight of his failures and the slimmest, most difficult sliver of hope. The official dedication of the Sterling Hall for Valor took place a month later, on a crisp, clear Saturday. The brass letters spelling out Harrington were gone, replaced by the new, more fitting name. There was no grand gala this time, no parade of political elites. It was a smaller, more solemn affair. The guests of honor were the families of fallen medics, Gold Star mothers and fathers, widows, and their children. David, now a civilian member of the Board of Trustees, stood at the podium. He was not in a uniform or a janitor's outfit, but a simple, well-tailored dark gray suit. He looked out at the crowd, and his eyes found Maya in the front row, sitting next to Colonel Miller. She gave him a small, proud wave. "True honor is quiet," David began, his voice resonating with a new kind of authority, not the authority of command or wealth, but of moral clarity. It's not found in the names carved on buildings, but in the character carved into a person's soul. It's not about demanding respect, but about earning it through your actions, especially your actions toward those you believe are beneath you. He spoke of the quiet courage of the medics and corpsmen the hall was named for, the men and women who ran toward the sound of the guns, armed not with weapons of war, but with tools of healing. He spoke of service, not as a path to glory, but as a commitment to others. This building, he concluded, is not a monument to a single person or a single family. It is a reminder that the true strength of our nation, the true leadership, is often found in the quietest, most humble corners. It's found in the heart of the soldier who shares his water, the teacher who stays late, the father who chooses his daughter over fame, the medic who whispers, "Stay with me," in the darkness. Let this hall stand as a testament to them, the quiet heroes. As the crowd rose to their feet in a wave of heartfelt applause, David's eyes met Colonel Miller's. The colonel gave him a slow, single nod. It was a gesture that spoke volumes of shared history, mutual respect, and a battle finally, truly won. Later, as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow on the newly christened building, David and Maya walked across the main lawn, hand in hand. The air was cool, and David draped his suit jacket over his daughter's shoulders. "Did you really save 200 people, Daddy?" she asked, her small voice filled with awe. David smiled down at her, his face softening. "A lot of people did a lot of brave things on a very bad day, sweetie. I was just one of them. Colonel Miller says you're a hero." "Colonel Miller is a good friend," David said, "but being your dad is the only hero job I've ever wanted." She squeezed his hand. "You're the best at it," she said with the simple conviction of a child. They stopped and looked back at Sterling Hall, its windows glowing warmly in the twilight. Behind it, the wild, untouched land of the new conservancy was already sinking into shadow, a quiet, living testament to a different kind of legacy. David's life was no longer hidden. His past and present had merged. He was Sergeant Sterling, the hero of Karangal Valley. He was David Sterling, the philanthropist and board member. But most importantly, standing here with his daughter's hand in his, he was just Dad. And he knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that he had finally brought all his soldiers home. What a powerful journey of dignity and quiet strength. The story of David Sterling teaches us that true worth is measured not by our status or the applause of the crowd, but by our character and the way we treat others, especially when no one is watching. It's a reminder that integrity is a superpower. What do you think? Was the Harringtons' downfall a just consequence of their actions, or was it too harsh? I'd love to read your thoughts on this in the comments below. Your perspective makes our community richer. And if this story resonated with you, please don't forget to give it a like and subscribe for more content that explores the triumph of the human spirit. Thank you for joining me on this journey today, and we'll see you in the next story.